Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. This is very much an I told you so kind of week for many people in domestic and international politics. On the domestic side, a lot of people have been telling the Democratic Party, maybe you shouldn't pin your Senate hopes on a guy with a Nazi tattoo. It wasn't the Nazi tattoo that did in Graham Platner, of course. It was a rape allegation that caused the left wing of the party to finally give up on their beloved putative oysterman. The big question for Democrats now is how to salvage Maine, which they pretty much have to win in order to take control of the Senate. It's looking to be a real self-inflicted wound for the party. On the international front, the I told you so's are coming from people who had no faith in either the Iranian regime's desire to shed its deeply embedded extremism or in the Trump administration's ability to negotiate a complex and durable deal, a deal that might cause American voters, among others, to think that maybe this war was actually worth it. Joining me tonight to discuss all of this and more, Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent at the New York Times. Leanne Caldwell is the chief Washington correspondent at Puck. Susan Glasser is a staff writer at The New Yorker. And Adam Harris is a staff writer and the host of Radio Atlantic. Welcome, all of you. Adam, I'll start with you. I guess the Platner story in Maine is about the importance of vetting, among other things. I mean, the Democrats are really in a hole here because of what happened.
They are, right? And they knew kind of going into this race kind of over the last several months that they needed to flip at least 4 seats, right? And Maine, Michigan, Ohio, Alaska, right? These were the seats that they were sort of looking at as the places where
Maine almost like number one.
Maine almost number one, right? But I think that a part of this, it comes out of them over-learning or sort of learning the wrong lesson from 2020 and 2024, sort of looking for the prototypical candidate who can win back, the sort of isolated white male voters that they may have thought that they lost to President Trump, as opposed to sort of understanding a policy preference that voters might be thinking of, a dissatisfaction with an establishment that they might be thinking of, as opposed to an identity that they thought that the voters might be interested in.
Remember the Brady Bunch episode when they made Greg a rock star because he fit the suit?
I actually don't.
Because you're younger than I am? Is that what you're trying to imply? You're successfully implying it, but that's what came to mind for me. Leanne, how did this happen? Like, how do you go from a guy no one's ever heard of to becoming the standard bearer for what Adam is talking about, the white working class, we're going to get him back, to this disaster?
So, obviously, Graham Platner was found by these political operatives, young political operatives who did very little vetting. And he was connected with an agency that focuses on these progressive candidates. But how he gained so much support is he is charismatic. He was a good messenger. And he had the message that the progressive left, the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, is really looking for. It's anti-corporate, anti-APAC. There's calling out a genocide in Gaza, Medicare for all of these economic issues that were really important to this faction of the Democratic Party that really motivated voters in Maine.
Right. But, well, it's very interesting to sort of do a postmortem of the process. But let's talk about what happens in the next few days as well. Because the Democrats in Maine have to get a candidate to run against a very formidable person.
Yeah.
So what are they going to do to figure out how to get this going again?
Yeah, so the Maine Democratic Party is trying to figure out a process in a very quick amount of time. They have to have a process by June 27th or
There's
July
never
27th.
been a process before for
no.
this, because he is the nominee. He was the nominee.
Friday evening, he finally officially withdrew.
Right.
So there are candidates who are putting their names forward. They have to get 500 signatures to be officially confirmed or on the ballot. And then everyone's trying to figure out what this process is. They are still working on it. But what they don't want is they don't want the party, they don't want their thumbs on the scale by the National Democratic Party. They don't want to be accused like they are trying to skirt or place someone that they want in the process. They are took a lot of lessons from the Kamala Harris-Joe Biden situation 2 years ago. So they're trying to make it look as open and transparent and inclusive for Maine Democrats as possible. But I will say there's this internal battle still of what this candidate is going to look like. Some of the progressives are already getting behind people. There's the more centrist faction of the party who says we need someone with a pulse who can unite the party. And so, you know, this is just the beginning of a very complicated way to try to beat the most battle-tested Republican senator on the map right now.
Right. Peter, I want you to watch Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders talk about Platner before the rape allegation surfaced.
And I said to myself, that's my kind of man. Because that is a man who not only has the values, but a man who believes in accountability.
The guy that I saw up on the stage in Portland, Maine, rather brilliant guy. I mean, really a strong fighter for the working class, very articulate, very smart. And I think as a nation, especially given the fact that we have a president who is convicted of 34 felonies, maybe we have to do a little bit of forgiveness.
So going to Adam's point, is this desire on the part of the Democrats for the perfect archetype, is that hurting the party? Rather than looking for individuals who might make good senators and who could win their states, this hunt for this archetype, is that what's...
Yeah, it's a hunt for an archetype, and I think there's a willingness to suspend disbelief about people from your own party that you wouldn't have for people of the other party, right? In other words, they would never have accepted a Republican candidate who had a Nazi tattoo. They would have said, that's outrageous. How could the Republicans nominate somebody like that? But if it's our guy, well, let's talk about redemption. Let's talk about somebody who has overcome his past to speak out for the values that we endorse. And I think that, you know, it's a sign of where politics is today, right? We are willing to accept all kinds of things on our side because we don't like the other side so much. And where do you draw that line? And in this case, they were willing to take a guy who had no history in elective politics that they could then, you know, vet. And if you want to have an outsider, you're going to end up taking a chance. There's a reason why insiders run again and again, is because they have, for the most part, had some vetting at least. But this is an anti-insider year. You want to run against the insiders. That's the risk.
I have to say I'm a little bit shocked that you're suggesting that tribalized hyperpartisanship makes you stupid. But
it's your word, but I think it certainly changes your viewpoint.
Right.
And I also, there's this world, right, where we should be thinking of forgiveness in politics, right? This isn't just Platner, right? This is any generic candidate, right? People should be able to have things in their past that it's like, I've grown from that. But our colleague Liz Brunick wrote about a month ago about the idea that he was also obfuscating. He wasn't being completely upfront at the beginning about all of the things that would have shown up, right? It goes to the idea of vetting.
To be clear, though, I'm not sure that most Americans would agree with the idea that we should forgive someone who's been credibly accused of raping someone.
Oh, absolutely.
That maybe in their personal life, or maybe that, you know, they should have a job. But do you really want someone like that in the Senate, even if they say, well, gee, you know, I had a really tough past?
Well, the Democrats had a very stringent attitude about Brett Kavanaugh for something much...
Well, and in fact, of course, Brett Kavanaugh is the main issue that Democrats had hoped to talk about when it comes to defeating Susan Collins. So, you know, first of all, right, if you're explaining, you're losing. And I haven't heard the word Susan Collins very much at all this week. It was really notable. If you looked at Graham Platner's very combative video announcing very reluctantly that he was pulling out of the race, he never mentioned Susan Collins. He never mentioned, you know, the need for his party to come together, or, you know, the goals that he said he was professing. It was I thought it was a very angry, narcissistic performance. And again, it points to this idea and this question, I think, for Democrats as well as Republicans. Is it the combative style of politics that Democrats now want in their candidates, or is it about an ideological shift? And I think, you know, who didn't have a hangover this week in many ways, or a reminder of Democrats with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and a last-minute replacement of a candidate, that doesn't tend to work out all that well. The New York Times did a good job of pulling up all of the Senate races in the last 30 years where this has happened. It's very unusual. Only 9 times, and by the way, only twice did the replacement candidate win.
Right, right. Going back to what Adam was saying, I think that the rape allegation, I shouldn't say that it's across the board. It voids out a candidate's efficacy, because we know some examples, obviously some pretty large examples. But I think Adam was talking more about the Nazi tattoo, which, by the way, and we've talked about this on the show in last month or two, I was surprised that the Nazi tattoo, in and of itself, wasn't enough. And Peter's exactly right. If a Republican candidate, even a very moderate Republican candidate, is Susan Collins, so it's hard to picture Susan Collins with any tattoo, a moderate Republican who had a Nazi tattoo, the Democrats would have come down like a ton of bricks, obviously, on them.
And yet our politics is such that on the same day that Graham Platner was accused of this, Donald Trump was ordered to pay $5 million to E. Jean Carroll, finally resolving her lawsuit, her successful lawsuit accusing him of sexual abuse. He was found liable by a court of law for having sexually abused E. Jean Carroll, and he's president of the United States.
Well, for reasons that will take up books, we understand generally that there's huge carve-outs in our culture for Donald Trump's behavior, Access Hollywood, going back to that.
And his party. I mean, look at Ken Paxton and, where Republicans have not abandoned him. I didn't see a big resumed call this week for him to drop out of the race, despite the many, many disturbing allegations against him.
Right.
Now, the flip side is, and I'm not usually, as you know, Jeff, the person who's like, oh, let's be all optimistic and upbeat here. But from the point of view of Democrats, this was a pretty divisive, damaging, I told you so week. However, it did come before this July 13th deadline for them to get a new candidate who might have a better chance to win. And I think if you look at the map overall of the Senate, to your point, the fact that it's even in play is a remarkable reminder of what we haven't been talking about, which is that Donald Trump has sunk to alarming low levels with the public.
Right.
There's little sign of him recovering. And as a result of that, as well as actually some strong Democratic candidates in places like North Carolina or Ohio or Alaska that might not have otherwise been in play, you're looking at that. You're seeing huge turnout.
Right.
From Democrats in the primary.
Well, Liam, let's talk about what Susan's referring to, the national picture for the 4 seats. They need to pick up a 4. Are they going to get it?
Well, actually, Washington Democrats think that now that Graham Platner is out of the race, they actually think they have a better chance of beating Susan Collins.
Is that what they think, or is that what they say?
Well, they were looking at polling leading up. The New York Times Siena poll showed that Platner's support was starting to soften, and that was before these rape allegations came out. It was after other allegations. His fundraising had almost completely dried up. His big donors were not giving money to him, and so there was a lot of concerns about the viability of Graham Platner before this story even was released. And so they're thrilled that this is happening before this deadline so that they at least have an opportunity to try to get someone on the ballot to beat Susan Collins. Now, how it plays out, how the Democratic Party shuffles money around and how they spend money is still TBD. I'm told by sources that they expect to still spend in Maine, which they had announced earlier this week that if Platner was still on the ballot, that they were not going to. And so they expect with someone who is a relatively normal Democrat that it will once again be in play again. But this is a critical seat for them. This is the bluest seat of all the ones that they have to pick up in order to win back the Senate. And so we'll see. I will just about so many Democrats who are excusing so many things of Graham Platner. There was this internal battle that was happening in the party that the progressive left, again, they were excusing all of this because this was part of their plan and so necessary for them to prove to the Democratic Party that they could win with their policies, with their people, with their priorities in a barely blue state that give them legitimacy also heading into other Senate races and into 2028. And so that's a big reason why so many Democrats on the left were excusing this, because Platner was really their big hope of what the direction of the party could be.
Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the other states that are possibly in play, the Democratic candidates are definitely more to the center. Maybe, well, in Michigan, we have to wait.
Michigan,
and see.
Michigan is still a wait and see. But yes, and they are more to the center. I think but to Leanne's point, right? This was an opportunity for Democrats to say, or the progressive Democrats to say, look, this is our candidate. He has the profile of someone who might draw in moderate voters, might draw in voters who actually don't pay attention that often, but they might understand identity politics a little bit better, or as they see an oysterman, right, who is he works with his hands, and that's the sort of image that
he wasn't actually that much of an oysterman. Not the biggest scandal involving this guy, but
it's like these little.
He was a hobby oysterman.
Yeah. But they're like those little half truths, right? That they can sort of get away with that an average viewer wouldn't see, but us, kind of paying attention to it pretty often, do.
Because we pay so much attention to oyster farming here at Washington Week, generally.
But it did seem that he had united a sort of base there in Maine, right? So the Democratic base was energized around his policy, even if they weren't energized around his person.
Right.
And so it will be interesting seeing going forward if any of the sort of candidates who will surface can energize that base as well as drawing in some.
It's going to be a big theme into the fall.